Remember the time you fell off your bike or bumped your head on a sharp corner? Childhood injuries are things we'd often like to forget, but our bodies often carry the memories in the form of scars. So what are these unwanted souvenirs, and why do we keep them for so long after that unintended vacation to the emergency room? The most common place we see scars are on our skin, a patch that looks slightly different from the normal skin around it. Often, this is considered an unfortunate disfigurement, while other times, deliberate scarification has been used in both traditional and modern cultures to mark a rite of passage, or simply for aesthetic decoration. But the difference isn't only cosmetic. When we look at healthy skin tissue under a microscope, we see the cells that perform various functions connected by an extracellular matrix, or ECM. This is composed of structural proteins, like collagen, secreted by specialized fibroblast cells. Well-arranged ECM allows for transportation of nutrients, cell-to-cell communication, and cell adhesion. But when a deep wound occurs, this arrangement is disrupted. During the process of wound healing, collagen is redeposited at the wound site. But instead of the basket weave formation found in healthy tissue, the new ECM is aligned in a single direction, impeding intercell processes and reducing durability and elasticity. To make matters worse, the healed tissue contains a higher proportion of ECM than before, reducing its overall function. In the skin, the overabundance of collagen interferes with its original functions, like producing sweat, controlling body temperature, and even growing hair. The scar tissue is fragile, sensitive to changes in temperature and sensation, and should be kept in moist environments to maximize healing. This presence of excessive fibrous connective tissue in an organ is known as fibrosis. And if that term sounds familiar, it's because our skin is not the only organ vulnerable to scarring. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder that causes scarring of the pancreas, while pulmonary fibrosis is a scarring of the lungs, resulting in shortness of breath. Scarring of the heart and the buildup of ECM following a heart attack can inhibit its beating, leading to further heart problems. What's common to all these conditions is that although it retains some of the original functions, the scar tissue formed after a wound is inferior to the native tissue it replaces. However, there is hope. Medical researchers are now studying what causes fibroblast cells to secrete excessive amounts of collagen, and how we can recruit the body's other cells in regenerating and repopulating the damaged tissue. By learning how to better control wound healing and the formation of scar tissue, we can utilize the multi-billion-dollar budgets currently used to address the aftermath of wounding in a much more efficient manner and help millions of people live better and healthier lives. But until then, at least some of our scars can help us remember to avoid the sorts of things that cause them. The largest organ in your body isn't your liver or your brain, it's your skin, with a surface area of about 20 square feet in adults. Though different areas of the skin have different characteristics, much of this surface performs similar functions, such as sweating, feeling heat and cold, and growing hair. But after a deep cut or wound, the newly healed skin will look different from the surrounding area and may not fully regain all its abilities for a while, or at all. To understand why this happens, we need to look at the structure of the human skin. The top layer, called the epidermis, consists mostly of hardened cells, called keratinocytes, and provides protection. Since its outer layer is constantly being shed and renewed, it's pretty easy to repair. But sometimes a wound penetrates into the dermis, which contains blood vessels and the various glands and nerve endings that enable the skin's many functions. And when that happens, it triggers the 4 overlapping stages of the regenerative process. The first stage, hemostasis, is the skin's response to 2 immediate threats: that you're now losing blood and that the physical barrier of the epidermis has been compromised. As the blood vessels tighten to minimize the bleeding in a process known as vasoconstriction, both threats are averted by forming a blood clot. A special protein known as fibrin forms crosslinks on the top of the skin, preventing blood from flowing out and bacteria or pathogens from getting in. After about 3 hours of this, the skin begins to turn red, signaling the next stage, inflammation. With bleeding under control and the barrier secured, the body sends special cells to fight any pathogens that may have gotten through. Among the most important of these are white blood cells, known as macrophages, which devour bacteria and damaged tissue through a process known as phagocytosis, in addition to producing growth factors to spur healing. And because these tiny soldiers need to travel through the blood to get to the wound site, the previously constricted blood vessels now expand in a process called vasodilation. About 2 to 3 days after the wound, the proliferative stage occurs, when fibroblast cells begin to enter the wound. In the process of collagen deposition, they produce a fibrous protein called collagen in the wound site, forming connective skin tissue to replace the fibrin from before. As epidermal cells divide to reform the outer layer of skin, the dermis contracts to close the wound. Finally, in the 4th stage of remodeling, the wound matures as the newly deposited collagen is rearranged and converted into specific types. Through this process, which can take over a year, the tensile strength of the new skin is improved, and blood vessels and other connections are strengthened. With time, the new tissue can reach from 50 to 80% of some of its original healthy function, depending on the severity of the initial wound and on the function itself. But because the skin does not fully recover, scarring continues to be a major clinical issue for doctors around the world. And even though researchers have made significant strides in understanding the healing process, many fundamental mysteries remain unresolved. For instance, do fibroblast cells arrive from the blood vessels or from skin tissue adjacent to the wound? And why do some other mammals, such as deer, heal their wounds much more efficiently and completely than humans? By finding the answers to these questions and others, we may one day be able to heal ourselves so well that scars will be just a memory.
Geckos and grasshoppers, worms and watermelons, elephants and Escherichia coli, man and mushroom. All so different in form and function, but amazingly the same in how their form and function are determined. First, all these organisms are made of one or more cells, and every cell of every living thing on Earth contains all the information it takes to create and duplicate and make variations of itself. That information is stored in a very long but quite simple double molecule called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. And the DNA of every living organism is made of chains of 4 smaller molecules called nucleotides. What dictates the difference between a man and a mushroom is the sequence of these nucleotides in the long DNA chain. The 4 differing nucleotide parts, called bases, are made of a few carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus atoms, and the molecules look like this. And each of these 4 bases is attached to an identical backbone molecule, a sugar called deoxyribose, the D in DNA, and a phosphate group. Let's simplify these nucleotides and show them like this. So, a single sequence of nucleotides joined by their common sugars would look like this. And the DNA molecule where such sequences are stored looks like this. But how does a simple molecule dictate the form and function of millions of different living things? You can think of DNA as a great library of information that is used to do one thing and one thing only, direct the building of different protein molecules. And it's the proteins that build the cells and keep them functioning and changing and reproducing. Here's where the familiar word gene comes in. If your DNA is a library of information, a gene is a book in that library. A gene is a segment of the DNA molecule. Let's say your body needs a particular protein, like insulin. To get it, some of your cells send a protein signal through the bloodstream to the cells in your pancreas, where insulin is made. That signal protein tells other proteins in the cell's nuclei to open up a part of the DNA double helix, the insulin gene, and start making insulin proteins. As soon as enough insulin has been produced, another signal protein comes to the pancreas's cells that tells them to stop making insulin. It's like looking up a book in the DNA library about insulin and then putting it back when you're done. There are genes in DNA for visible and invisible things that make up your body, like genes for eye color protein pigments, for skin color, for hair color, for stopping and starting bone growth, for your blood type, for how many fingers or arms and legs you have, for proteins that influence how long you live. Your DNA probably contains between 25,000 and 40,000 genes, while the DNA of a worm or a plant or a fruit fly contains about 12,000 to 20,000 genes. Some of those genes have quite different sequences of nucleotides than yours, and some are similar to yours. Though it happens infrequently, our own nucleotide sequences can change as the result of spontaneous or environmental damage, which might remove or shift a nucleotide position. This changes the gene involved and can then change the protein. Most of these changes, called mutations, have very little effect on the organism or its descendants. Some are mildly damaging, and a few can make the organism better suited to its environment. It is these tiny changes in DNA gene sequences happening over millions of years that create the differences among living organisms. From geckos to grasshoppers, worms to watermelons, elephants to Escherichia coli, and man to mushroom.
Now, our next speaker has spent his whole career eliciting that sense of wonder. Please welcome John Lloyd.
The question is, what is invisible? There's more of it than you think, actually. Everything, I would say, everything that matters, except everything, and except matter. We can see matter, but we can't see what's the matter. We can see the stars and the planets, but we can't see what holds them apart or what draws them together. With matter, as with people, we see only the skin of things. We can't see into the engine room. We can't see what makes people tick, at least not without difficulty. And the closer we look at anything, the more it disappears. In fact, if you look really closely at stuff, if you look at the basic substructure of matter, there isn't anything there. Electrons disappear in a kind of fuzz, and there is only energy. One of the interesting things about invisibility is that things that we can't see, we also can't understand. Gravity is one thing that we can't see and which we don't understand. It's the least understood of all the four fundamental forces and the weakest, and nobody really knows what it is or why it's there. For what it's worth, Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist who ever lived, he thought Jesus came to Earth specifically to operate the levers of gravity. That's what he thought he was there for. So, bright guy. Could be wrong on that one, I don't know. Consciousness. I see all your faces. I've no idea what any of you are thinking. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it incredible that we can't read each other's minds when we can touch each other, taste each other perhaps if we get close enough, but we can't read each other's minds? I find that quite astonishing. In the Sufi faith, this great Middle Eastern religion, which some claim is the root of all religions, Sufi masters are all telepaths, so they say. But their main exercise of telepathy is to send out powerful signals to the rest of us that it doesn't exist. So that's why we don't think it exists, the Sufi masters working on us. In the question of consciousness and artificial intelligence is really, like the study of consciousness, got nowhere. We have no idea how consciousness works. Not only have they not created artificial intelligence, they haven't yet created artificial stupidity. The laws of physics, invisible, eternal, omnipresent, all-powerful. Remind you of anyone? Interesting. I'm, as you can guess, not a materialist, I'm an immaterialist, and I found a very useful new word, agnostic, okay? I'm an agnostic. I refuse to be drawn on the question of whether God exists until somebody properly defines the terms. Another thing we can't see is the human genome, and this is increasingly peculiar because about 20 years ago, when they started delving into the genome, they thought it would probably contain around 100,000 genes. Every year since, it's been revised downwards. We now think there are likely to be only just over 20,000 genes in the human genome. This is extraordinary because rice, get this, rice is known to have 38,000 genes. Potatoes have 48 chromosomes, 2 more than people, and the same as a gorilla. You can't see these things, but they are very strange. The stars by day, I always think that's fascinating. The universe disappears. The more light there is, the less you can see. Time. Nobody can see time. I don't know if you know this, modern physicists, there's a big movement in modern physics to decide that time doesn't really exist because it's too inconvenient for the figures. It's much easier if it's not really there. You can't see the future, obviously, and you can't see the past except in your memory. One of the interesting things about the past is you particularly can't see. My son asked me this the other day. He said, "Dad, can you remember what I was like when I was 2?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Why can't I?" Isn't that extraordinary? You cannot remember what happened to you earlier than the age of 2 or 3, which is great news for psychoanalysts, because otherwise they'd be out of a job, because that's where all the stuff happens. That makes you who you are. Another thing you can't see is the grid on which we hang. This is fascinating. You probably know, some of you, that cells are continually renewed. Skin flakes off, hairs grow, nails, that kind of stuff. But every cell in your body is replaced at some point. Taste buds every 10 days or so. Livers and internal organs take a bit longer. A spine takes several years. But at the end of 7 years, not one cell in your body remains from what was there 7 years ago. The question is, who then are we? What are we? What is this thing that we hang on that is actually us? Atoms, can't see them. Nobody ever will. Smaller than the wavelength of light. Gas, can't see that. Interesting, somebody mentioned 1600 recently. Gas was invented in 1600 by a Dutch chemist called Van Helmont, and it's said to be the most successful ever invention of a word by a known individual. Quite good. He also invented a word called blas, for meaning astral radiation. Didn't catch on, unfortunately. But well done him. Light. You can't see light. When it's dark in a vacuum, if a person shines a beam of light straight across your eyes, you won't see it. It's slightly technical. Some physicists will disagree with this, but it's odd that you can't see the beam of light. You can only see what it hits. Electricity, you can't see that. Don't let anyone tell you they understand electricity. They don't. Nobody knows what it is. You probably think the electrons in an electric wire move instantaneously down a wire, don't you, at the speed of light when you turn the light on? They don't. Electrons bumble down the wire about the speed of spreading honey, they say. Galaxies, 100 billion of them estimated in the universe. 100 billion. How many can we see? 5. 5 out of the 100 billion galaxies with the naked eye, and one of them is quite difficult to see unless you've got very good eyesight. Radio waves, there's another thing. Heinrich Hertz, when he discovered radio waves in 1887, he called them radio waves because they radiated. Somebody said to him, "Well, what's the point of these, Heinrich? What's the point of these radio waves that you've found?" And he said, "Well, I've no idea, but I guess somebody will find a use for them someday." The biggest thing that's invisible to us is what we don't know. It is incredible how little we know. Thomas Edison once said, "We don't know 1% of 1/1,000,000th about anything." And I've come to the conclusion, because you asked this other question, what's another thing we can't see? The point, most of us. What's the point? The point, what I've got it down to, is there are only 2 questions really worth asking. Why are we here? And what should we do about it while we are? To help you, I've got 2 things to leave you with from 2 great philosophers, perhaps 2 of the greatest philosopher-thinkers of the 20th century, one a mathematician and engineer, and the other a poet. The first is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said, "I don't know why we are here, but I'm pretty sure it's not in order to enjoy ourselves." He was a cheerful bastard, wasn't he? And secondly and lastly, W.H. Auden, one of my favorite poets, who said, "We are here on earth to help others. What the others are here for, I've no idea."
know an older left-handed person, chances are they had to learn to write or eat with their right hand. And in many parts of the world, it's still common practice to force children to use their proper hand. Even the word for right also means correct or good, not just in English, but many other languages too. But if being left-handed is so wrong, then why does it happen in the first place? Today, about 1/10 of the world's population are left-handed. Archaeological evidence shows that it's been that way for as long as 500,000 years, with about 10% of human remains showing the associated differences in arm length and bone density, and some ancient tools and artifacts showing evidence of left-hand use. And despite what many may think, handedness is not a choice. It can be predicted even before birth, based on the fetus's position in the womb. So if handedness is inborn, does that mean it's genetic? Well, yes and no. Identical twins who have the same genes can have different dominant hands. In fact, this happens as often as it does with any other sibling pair. But the chances of being right or left-handed are determined by the handedness of your parents in surprisingly consistent ratios. If your father was left-handed but your mother was right-handed, you have a 17% chance of being born left-handed, while two righties will have a left-handed child only 10% of the time. Handedness seems to be determined by a roll of the dice, but the odds are set by your genes. All of this implies there's a reason that evolution has produced this small proportion of lefties and maintained it over the course of millennia. And while there have been several theories attempting to explain why handedness exists in the first place, or why most people are right-handed, a recent mathematical model suggests that the actual ratio reflects a balance between competitive and cooperative pressures on human evolution. The benefits of being left-handed are clearest in activities involving an opponent, like combat or competitive sports. For example, about 50% of top hitters in baseball have been left-handed. Why? Think of it as a surprise advantage. Because lefties are a minority to begin with, both right-handed and left-handed competitors will spend most of their time encountering and practicing against righties. So when the two face each other, the left-hander will be better prepared against this right-handed opponent, while the righty will be thrown off. This fighting hypothesis, where an imbalance in the population results in an advantage for left-handed fighters or athletes, is an example of negative frequency-dependent selection. But according to the principles of evolution, groups that have a relative advantage tend to grow until that advantage disappears. If people were only fighting and competing throughout human evolution, natural selection would lead to more lefties being the ones that made it, until there were so many of them that it was no longer a rare asset. So in a purely competitive world, 50% of the population would be left-handed. But human evolution has been shaped by cooperation as well as competition, and cooperative pressure pushes handedness distribution in the opposite direction. In golf, where performance doesn't depend on the opponent, only 4% of top players are left-handed, an example of the wider phenomenon of tool sharing. Just as young potential golfers can more easily find a set of right-handed clubs, many of the important instruments that have shaped society were designed for the right-handed majority. Because lefties are worse at using these tools and suffer from higher accident rates, they would be less successful in a purely cooperative world, eventually disappearing from the population. So by correctly predicting the distribution of left-handed people in the general population, as well as matching data from various sports, the model indicates that the persistence of lefties as a small but stable minority reflects an equilibrium that comes from competitive and cooperative effects playing out simultaneously over time. And the most intriguing thing is what the numbers can tell us about various populations, from the skewed distribution of pawedness in cooperative animals to the slightly larger percentage of lefties in competitive hunter-gatherer societies. We may even find that the answers to some puzzles of early human evolution are already in our hands.
Beneath your ribs, you'll find, among other things, the pancreas, an organ that works a lot like a personal health coach. This organ controls your sugar levels and produces a special juice that releases the nutrients from your food to help keep you in the best possible shape. The pancreas sits just behind your stomach, an appropriate home, as one of its jobs is to break down the food you eat. It aids digestion by producing a special tonic made of water, sodium bicarbonate, and digestive enzymes. Sodium bicarbonate neutralizes the stomach's natural acidity, so these digestive enzymes can perform their jobs. Lipase breaks down fatty substances. Protease splits up proteins, and amylase divides carbohydrates to create energy-rich sugars. Most of those nutrients then get absorbed into the bloodstream and go on to enrich the body. While all this is happening, the pancreas works on another critical task, controlling the amount of sugar in your blood. It achieves this with the hormones insulin and glucagon, which are produced in special cells called the islets of Langerhans. Having too much or too little sugar can be life-threatening, so the pancreas must stay on constant alert. After a big meal, the blood often becomes flushed with sugar. To bring us back to normal, the pancreas releases insulin, which makes the excess sugar move into cells where it's either used as an energy source or stored for later. Insulin also tells the liver to shut down sugar production. On the other hand, if blood sugar is low, the pancreas releases a hormone called glucagon that tells the body's cells and liver to release stored sugars back into the bloodstream. The interplay between insulin and glucagon is what keeps our sugar levels balanced. But a faulty pancreas can no longer coach us like this, meaning that this healthy balance is destroyed. If it's weakened by disease, the organ's ability to produce insulin may be reduced or even extinguished, which can trigger the condition known as diabetes. Without regular insulin release, sugar steadily builds up in the blood, eventually hardening the blood vessels and causing heart attacks, kidney failure, and strokes. The same lack of insulin deprives cells of the energy-rich sugar they need to grow and function. People with diabetes also tend to have higher levels of glucagon, which makes even more sugar circulate. Without this internal health coach, our sugar levels would go haywire, and we wouldn't be able to digest important nutrients. But like any coach, it's not the pancreas's job alone to keep us healthy. It needs our conscious participation too.
There's a factory inside you that weighs about 1.4 kilograms and runs for 24 hours a day. This is your liver, the heaviest organ in your body and one of the most crucial. This industrious structure simultaneously acts as a storehouse, a manufacturing hub, and a processing plant. And each of these functions involves so many important subtasks that without the liver, our bodies would simply stop working. One of the liver's main functions is to filter the body's blood, which it receives in regular shipments from two sources. The hepatic artery delivers blood from the heart, while the hepatic portal vein brings it from the intestine. This double delivery fills the liver with nutrients that it then sorts, processes, and stores with the help of thousands of tiny internal processing plants known as lobules. Both blood flows also deliver the oxygen that the liver needs to function. The blood that is received from the intestine contains carbohydrates, fats, and vitamins and other nutrients dissolved in it from the food you've consumed. These must be processed in different ways. In the case of carbohydrates, the liver breaks them down and converts them into sugars for the body to use as energy when the filtered blood is sent back out. Sometimes the body has leftovers of nutrients that it doesn't immediately require. When that happens, the liver holds some back and stacks them in its storage facility. This facility works like a pantry for future cases when the body might be in need of nutrients. But the blood flowing into the liver isn't always full of good things. It also contains toxins and byproducts that the body can't use, and the liver monitors these strictly. When it spots a useless or toxic substance, it either converts it into a product that can't hurt the body or isolates it and whisks it away, channeling it through the kidneys and intestine to be excreted. Of course, we wouldn't consider the liver a factory if it didn't also manufacture things. This organ makes everything from various blood plasma proteins that transport fatty acids and help form blood clots, to the cholesterol that helps the body create hormones. It also makes vitamin D and substances that help digestion. But one of its most vital products is bile. Like an eco-friendly treatment plant, the liver uses cells called hepatocytes to convert toxic waste products into this bitter greenish liquid. As it's produced, bile is funneled into a small container below the liver, called the gallbladder, before being trickled into the intestine to help break down fats, destroy microbes, and neutralize extra stomach acid. Bile also helps carry other toxins and byproducts from the liver out of the body. So as you can see, the liver is an extremely efficient industrial site, performing multiple tasks that support each other. But such a complex system needs to be kept running smoothly by keeping it healthy and not overloading it with more toxins than it can handle. This is one factory we simply can't afford to shut down. It's 4 a.m. and the big test is in 8 hours, followed by a piano recital. You've been studying and playing for days, but you still don't feel ready for either. So what can you do? Well, you can drink another cup of coffee and spend the next few hours cramming and practicing. But believe it or not, you might be better off closing the books, putting away the music, and going to sleep. Sleep occupies nearly a third of our lives, but many of us give surprisingly little attention and care to it. This neglect is often the result of a major misunderstanding. Sleep isn't lost time, or just a way to rest when all our important work is done. Instead, it's a critical function, during which your body balances and regulates its vital systems, affecting respiration and regulating everything from circulation to growth and immune response. That's great, but you can worry about all those things after this test, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out that sleep is also crucial for your brain, with 1/5 of your body's circulatory blood being channeled to it as you drift off. And what goes on in your brain while you sleep is an intensely active period of restructuring that's crucial for how our memory works. At first glance, our ability to remember things doesn't seem very impressive at all. 19th century psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus demonstrated that we normally forget 40% of new material within the first 20 minutes, a phenomenon known as the forgetting curve. But this loss can be prevented through memory consolidation, the process by which information is moved from our fleeting short-term memory to our more durable long-term memory. This consolidation occurs with the help of a major part of the brain, known as the hippocampus. Its role in long-term memory formation was demonstrated in the 1950s by Brenda Milner in her research with a patient known as HM. After having his hippocampus removed, HM's ability to form new short-term memories was damaged, but he was able to learn physical tasks through repetition. Due to the removal of his hippocampus, HM's ability to form long-term memories was also damaged. What this case revealed, among other things, was that the hippocampus was specifically involved in the consolidation of long-term declarative memory, such as the facts and concepts you need to remember for that test, rather than procedural memory, such as the finger movements you need to master for that recital. Milner's findings, along with work by Eric Kandel in the 90s, have given us our current model of how this consolidation process works. Sensory data is initially transcribed and temporarily recorded in the neurons as short-term memory. From there, it travels to the hippocampus, which strengthens and enhances the neurons in that cortical area. Thanks to the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, new synaptic buds are formed, allowing new connections between neurons and strengthening the neural network where the information will be returned as long-term memory. So why do we remember some things and not others? Well, there are a few ways to influence the extent and effectiveness of memory retention. For example, memories that are formed in times of heightened feeling or even stress will be better recorded due to the hippocampus's link with emotion. But one of the major factors contributing to memory consolidation is, you guessed it, a good night's sleep. Sleep is composed of 4 stages, the deepest of which are known as slow-wave sleep and rapid eye movement. EEG machines monitoring people during these stages have shown electrical impulses moving between the brainstem, hippocampus, thalamus, and cortex, which serve as relay stations of memory formation. And the different stages of sleep have been shown to help consolidate different types of memories. During the non-REM slow-wave sleep, declarative memory is encoded into a temporary store in the anterior part of the hippocampus. Through a continuing dialogue between the cortex and hippocampus, it is then repeatedly reactivated, driving its gradual redistribution to long-term storage in the cortex. REM sleep, on the other hand, with its similarity to waking brain activity, is associated with the consolidation of procedural memory. So based on the studies, going to sleep 3 hours after memorizing your formulas and 1 hour after practicing your scales would be the most ideal. So hopefully you can see now that skimping on sleep not only harms your long-term health, but actually makes it less likely that you'll retain all that knowledge and practice from the previous night. All of which just goes to affirm the wisdom of the phrase, sleep on it. When you think about all the internal restructuring and forming of new connections that occurs while you slumber, you could even say that proper sleep will have you waking up every morning with a new and improved brain, ready to face the challenges ahead. A, C, E, D, B, K. No, this isn't some random out-of-order alphabet. These are vitamins. And just like letters build words, they're the building blocks that keep the body running. Vitamins are organic compounds we need to ingest in small amounts to keep functioning. They're the body's builders, defenders, and maintenance workers, helping it to build muscle and bone, make use of nutrients, capture and use energy, and heal wounds. If you need convincing about vitamin value, just consider the plight of olden-day sailors who had no access to vitamin-rich fresh produce. They got scurvy, but vitamin C, abundant in fruits and vegetables, was the simple antidote to this disease. While bacteria, fungi, and plants produce their own vitamins, our bodies can't, so we have to get them from other sources. So how does the body get vitamins from out there into here? That's dependent on the form these compounds take. Vitamins come in 2 types, lipid-soluble and water-soluble, and the difference between them determines how the body transports and stores vitamins and gets rid of the excess. The water-solubles are vitamin C and B complex vitamins that are made up of 8 different types that each do something unique. These are dissolved in the watery parts of fruits, vegetables, and grains, meaning their passage through the body is relatively straightforward. Once inside the system, these foods are digested, and the vitamins within them are taken up directly by the bloodstream. Because blood plasma is water-based, water-soluble vitamins C and B have their transport cut out for them and can move around freely within the body. For lipid-soluble vitamins, dissolved in fat and found in foods like dairy, butter, and oils, this trip into the blood is a little more adventurous. These vitamins make it through the stomach and the intestine, where an acidic substance called bile flows in from the liver, breaking up the fat and preparing it for absorption through the intestinal wall. Because fat-soluble vitamins can't make use of the blood's watery nature, they need something else to move them around. And that comes from proteins that attach to the vitamins and act like couriers, transporting fat solubles into the blood and around the body. So this difference between water or fat-soluble vitamins determines how they get into the blood, but also how they're stored or ejected from the body. The system's ability to circulate water-soluble vitamins in the bloodstream so easily means that most of them can be passed out equally easily via the kidneys. Because of that, most water-soluble vitamins need to be replenished on a daily basis through the food we eat. But fat-soluble vitamins have staying power because they can be packed into the liver and in fat cells. The body treats these parts like a pantry, storing the vitamins there and rationing them out when needed, meaning we shouldn't overload on this type of vitamin because the body is generally well stocked. Once we've figured the logistics of transport and storage, the vitamins are left to do the work they came here to do in the first place. Some, like many of the B-complex vitamins, make up coenzymes, whose job it is to help enzymes release the energy from food. Other B vitamins then help the body to use that energy. From vitamin C, you get the ability to fight infection and make collagen, a kind of tissue that forms bones and teeth and heals wounds. Vitamin A helps make white blood cells, key in the body's defense, helps shape bones, and improves vision by keeping the cells of the eye in check. Vitamin D gathers calcium and phosphorus so we can make bones, and vitamin E works as an antioxidant, getting rid of elements in the body that can damage cells. Finally, from vitamin K, we score the ability to clot blood, since it helps make the proteins that do this job. Without this vitamin variety, humans face deficiencies that cause a range of problems, like fatigue, nerve damage, heart disorders, or diseases like rickets and scurvy. On the other hand, too much of any vitamin can cause toxicity in the body. So there goes the myth that loading yourself with supplements is a great idea. In reality, it's all about getting the balance right and hitting that vitamin jackpot. Many of us have hundreds of things on our minds at any moment, often struggling to keep track of everything we need to do. But fortunately, there's one important thing we don't have to worry about remembering: breathing. When you breathe, you transport oxygen to the body's cells to keep them working, and clear your system of the carbon dioxide that this work generates. Breathing, in other words, keeps the body alive. So how do we accomplish this crucial and complex task without even thinking about it? The answer lies in our body's respiratory system. Like any machinery, it consists of specialized components and requires a trigger to start functioning. Here, the components are the structures and tissues making up the lungs, as well as the various other respiratory organs connected to them. And to get this machine moving, we need the autonomic nervous system, our brain's unconscious control center for the vital functions. As the body prepares to take in oxygen-rich air, this system sends a signal to the muscles around your lungs, flattening the diaphragm and contracting the intercostal muscles between your ribs to create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth, through your trachea, and into the bronchi that split at the trachea's base, with one entering each lung. Like tree branches, these small tubes divide into thousands of tinier passages, called bronchioles. It's tempting to think of the lungs as huge balloons, but instead of being hollow, they're actually spongy inside, with the bronchioles running throughout the parenchyma tissue. At the end of each bronchiole is a little air sac called an alveolus, wrapped in capillaries full of red blood cells containing special proteins called hemoglobin. The air you've breathed in fills these sacs, causing the lungs to inflate. Here is where the vital exchange occurs. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide, and the air sacs are full of oxygen. But due to the basic process of diffusion, the molecules of each gas want to move to a place where there is a lower concentration of their kind. So as oxygen crosses over to the capillaries, the hemoglobin grabs it up, while the carbon dioxide is unloaded into the lungs. The oxygen-rich hemoglobin is then transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. But what do our lungs do with all that carbon dioxide? Exhale it, of course. The autonomic nervous system kicks in again, causing the diaphragm to ball up and the intercostal muscles to relax, making the chest cavity smaller and forcing the lungs to compress. The carbon dioxide-rich air is expelled, and the cycle begins again. So that's how these spongy organs keep our bodies efficiently supplied with air. Lungs inhale and exhale between 15 and 25 times a minute, which amounts to an incredible 10,000 liters of air each day. That's a lot of work, but don't sweat it. Your lungs and your autonomic nervous system have got it covered. Right now, you're probably sitting down to watch this video, and staying seated for a few minutes to view it is probably okay. But the longer you stay put, the more agitated your body becomes. It sits there counting down the moments until you stand up again and take it for a walk. That may sound ridiculous. Our bodies love to sit, right? Not really. Sure, sitting for brief periods can help us recover from stress or recuperate from exercise. But nowadays, our lifestyles make us sit much more than we move around, and our bodies simply aren't built for such a sedentary existence. In fact, just the opposite is true. The human body is built to move, and you can see evidence of that in the way it's structured. Inside us are over 360 joints and about 700 skeletal muscles that enable easy, fluid motion. The body's unique physical structure gives us the ability to stand up straight against the pull of gravity. Our blood depends on us moving around to be able to circulate properly. Our nerve cells benefit from movement, and our skin is elastic, meaning it molds to our motions. So if every inch of the body is ready and waiting for you to move, what happens when you just don't? Let's start with the backbone of the problem, literally. Your spine is a long structure made of bones and the cartilage discs that sit between them. Joints, muscles, and ligaments that are attached to the bones hold it all together. A common way of sitting is with a curved back and slumped shoulders, a position that puts uneven pressure on your spine. Over time, this causes wear and tear in your spinal discs, overworks certain ligaments and joints, and puts strain on muscles that stretch to accommodate your back's curved position. This hunched shape also shrinks your chest cavity while you sit, meaning your lungs have less space to expand into when you breathe. That's a problem because it temporarily limits the amount of oxygen that fills your lungs and filters into your blood. Around the skeleton are the muscles, nerves, arteries, and veins that form the body's soft tissue layers. The very act of sitting squashes, pressurizes, and compresses, and these more delicate tissues really feel the brunt. Have you ever experienced numbness and swelling in your limbs when you sit? In areas that are the most compressed, your nerves, arteries, and veins can become blocked, which limits nerve signaling, causing the numbness, and reduces blood flow in your limbs, causing them to swell. Sitting for long periods also temporarily deactivates lipoprotein lipase, a special enzyme in the walls of blood capillaries that breaks down fats in the blood. So when you sit, you're not burning fat nearly as well as when you move around. What effect does all of this stasis have on the brain? Most of the time, you probably sit down to use your brain. But ironically, lengthy periods of sitting actually run counter to this goal. Being stationary reduces blood flow and the amount of oxygen entering your bloodstream through your lungs. Your brain requires both of those things to remain alert, so your concentration levels will most likely dip as your brain activity slows. Unfortunately, the ill effects of being seated don't only exist in the short term. Recent studies have found that sitting for long periods is linked with some types of cancers and heart disease, and can contribute to diabetes, kidney, and liver problems. In fact, researchers have worked out that worldwide, inactivity causes about 9% of premature deaths a year. That's over 5 million people. So what seems like such a harmless habit actually has the power to change our health. But luckily, the solutions to this mounting threat are simple and intuitive. When you have no choice but to sit, try switching the slouch for a straighter spine. And when you don't have to be bound to your seat, aim to move around much more, perhaps by setting a reminder to yourself to get up every half hour. But mostly, just appreciate that bodies are built for motion, not for stillness. In fact, since the video's almost over, why not stand up and stretch right now? Treat your body to a walk. It'll thank you later.
Today we are going to look at the world of Rome through the eyes of a young girl. Here she is, drawing a picture of herself in the atrium of her father's enormous house. Her name is Domitia, and she is just 5 years old. She has an older brother who is 14, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, named after her dad. Girls don't get these long names that boys have. What is worse is that Dad insists on calling all his daughters Domitia.
Domitia!
Let's call the Domitia, drawing on the column, Domitia 3. She has an older sister, Domitia 2, who is 7 years old, and then there is Domitia 1, who is 10. There would have been a Domitia 4, but Mum died trying to give birth to her 3 years ago. Confused? The Romans were too. They could work out ancestry through the male line with the nice tripartite names such as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. But they got in a real mess over which Domitia was married to whom and was either the great aunt or the great stepmother and so on to whom when they came to write it down. Domitia 3 is not just drawing on the pillar, she is also watching the action. You see, it's early and the time of day when all her dad's clients and friends come to see him at home to pay their respects. Lucius Papidius Secundus, a 17-year-old who wants to marry Domitia 2 within the next 5 to 7 years, has come as well. He seems to be wooing not his future wife, but her dad. Poor Lucius, he does not know that Domitia's dad thinks he and his family are wealthy, but still scumbags from the Suburra. After all, it is the part of Rome full of barbers and prostitutes. Suddenly, all the men are leaving with Dad. It's the second hour and time for him to be in court with a sturdy audience of clients to applaud his rhetoric and hiss at his opponent. The house is now quieter. The men won't return for 7 hours, not until dinner time. But what happens in the house for those 7 hours? What do Domitia, and Domitia do all day?
I don't know.
Not an easy question. Everything written down by the Romans that we have today was written by men. This makes constructing the lives of women difficult. However, we can't have a history of just Roman men, so here goes. We can begin in the atrium. There is a massive loom on which Dad's latest wife is working on a new toga. Domitia, and Domitia are tasked with spinning the wool that will be used to weave this mighty garment. 30 or more feet long and elliptical in shape. Romans love the idea that their wives work wool. We know that because it's written on the gravestones of so many Roman women. Unlike women in Greece, Roman women go out the house and move about the city. They go to the baths in the morning to avoid the men, or to separate baths that are for women only. Some do go in for the latest fad of the AD 70s, nude bathing with men present. Where they have no place is where the men are, in the forum, in the law court, or in the Senate house. Their place in public is in the porticos, with gardens, with sculpture, and with pathways for walking in. When Domitia, and Domitia want to leave the house to go somewhere, like the portico of Livia, they must get ready. Domitia 2 and Domitia 3 are ready, but Domitia 1, who is betrothed to be married in 2 years to darling Philetus, isn't ready. She's not slow, she just has more to do. Being betrothed means she wears the insignia of betrothal, engagement rings, and all the gifts Philetus has given her. Jewels, earrings, necklaces, amber pendants. She may even wear her myrtle crown. All this bling shouts, I'm getting married to that 19-year-old who gave me all this stuff I'm wearing. Whilst they wait, Domitia 2 and Domitia 3 play with their dolls that mirror the image of their sister, decked out to be married. One day, these dolls will be dedicated to the household gods on the day of their wedding. Okay, we're ready. The girls step into litters carried by some burly slaves. They also have a chaperone with them and will be meeting an aunt at the porticus of Livia. Carried high on the shoulders of these slaves, the girls look out through the curtains to see the crowded streets below them. They traverse the city, past the Colosseum, but then turn off to climb up the hill to the porticus of Livia. It was built by Livia, the wife of the first Emperor Augustus, on the site of the house of Vedius Pollio. He wasn't such a great guy. He once tried to feed a slave to the eels in his fish pond for simply dropping a dish. Luckily, the emperor was at the dinner and tamed his temper. The litters are placed on the ground and the girls get out, and arm in arm, 2 by 2, they ascend the steps into the enclosed garden with its many columns. Domitia 3 has shot off and is drawing on a column. Domitia 2 joins her, but seeks to read the graffiti higher up on the column. She spots a drawing of gladiators and tries to imagine seeing them fighting, something she will never be permitted to do, except from the very rear of the Colosseum. From there, she will have a good view of the 50,000 spectators, but will see little by way of blood and gore. If she really wanted a decent view, she could become a Vestal Virgin and would sit right down the front. But a career tending the sacred flame of Vesta is not to everybody's taste. Domitia 1 has met another 10-year-old, also decked out in the insignia of betrothal. Home time. When they get there, after the 8th hour, something is up. A smashed dish lies on the floor. All the slaves have been gathered together in the atrium and await the arrival of their master. Dad is going to go mad. He will not hit his children, but like many other Romans, he believes that slaves have to be punished. The whip lies ready for his arrival. No one knows who smashed the dish, but Dad will call the undertaker to torture it out of them if he must. The doorkeeper opens the front door to the house. A hush comes over the anxious slaves. In walks not their master, but instead a pregnant teenager. It is the master's eldest daughter, aged 15, who is already a veteran of marriage and childbirth. Guess what her name is? There is a 5 to 10% chance she won't survive giving birth to her child. But for now, she has come to dinner with her family. As a teenage mother, she has proved that she is a successful wife by bringing children and descendants for her husband, who will carry on his name in the future. The family head off to the dining room and are served dinner. It would seem Dad has had an invite to dinner elsewhere. With dinner concluded, the girls cross the atrium to bid farewell to their older sister, who's carried home in a litter escorted by some of Dad's bodyguards. Returning to the house, the girls cross the atrium. The slaves, young and old, male and female, await the return of their owner. When he returns, he may exact vengeance, ensuring his power over the slaves is maintained through violence and terror, to which any slave could be subjected. But for the girls, they head upstairs for the night, ready for bed.
It's a hot day, and you've just downed several glasses of water, one after the other. Behind the sudden urge that follows are 2 bean-shaped organs that work as fine-tuned internal sensors. They balance the amount of fluid in your body, detect waste in your blood, and know when to release the vitamins, minerals, and hormones you need to stay alive. Say hello to your kidneys. The main role of these organs is to dispose of waste products and to turn them into urine. The body's 8 liters of blood pass through the kidneys between 20 and 25 times each day, meaning that together, these organs filter about 180 liters every 24 hours. The ingredients in your blood are constantly changing as you ingest food and drink, which explains why the kidneys need to be on permanent duty. Blood enters each kidney through arteries that branch and branch until they form tiny vessels that entwine with special internal modules called nephrons. In each kidney, 1 million of these nephrons form a powerful array of filters and sensors that carefully sift through the blood. This is where we see just how refined and accurate this internal sensing system is. To filter the blood, each nephron uses 2 powerful pieces of equipment, a blob-like structure called a glomerulus, and a long stringy straw-like tubule. The glomerulus works like a sieve, allowing only certain ingredients, such as vitamins and minerals, to pass into the tubule. Then, this vessel's job is to detect whether any of those ingredients are needed in the body. If so, they're reabsorbed in amounts that the body needs so they can circulate in the blood again. But the blood doesn't only carry useful ingredients. It contains waste products too, and the nephrons have to figure out what to do with them. The tubules sense compounds the body doesn't need, like urea, left over from the breakdown of proteins, and redirects them as urine out of the kidneys and through 2 long sewers called ureters. These tubes empty their contents into the bladder to be discharged, ridding your body of that waste once and for all. There's water in that urine too. If the kidney detects too much of it in your blood, for instance, when you've chugged several glasses at once, it sends the extra liquid to the bladder to be removed. On the other hand, low water levels in the blood prompt the kidney to release some back into the bloodstream, meaning that less water makes it into the urine. This is why urine appears yellower when you're less hydrated. By controlling water, your kidneys stabilize the body's fluid levels. But this fine balancing act isn't the kidney's only skill. These organs have the power to activate vitamin D to secrete a hormone called renin that raises blood pressure, and another hormone called erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. Without the kidneys, our bodily fluids would spiral out of control. Every time we ate, our blood would receive another load of unsifted ingredients. Soon, the buildup of waste would overload our systems and we'd expire. So each kidney not only keeps things running smoothly, it also keeps us alive. Lucky, then, that we have 2 of these magical beans.
Hero! So many people in distress have said this. But why? What kind of hero do we need? And do we really even need a hero at all? Well, if you look at any piece of literature written for page, script, or stage, the answer is yes. But heroes come in all shapes and sizes depending on what needs to be dealt with. First, you have your epic heroes. Epic heroes usually come from a famous family, have superhuman strength, are unusually good-looking. They take on challenges that no one else will, and succeed. They have great journeys and adventures, some supernatural, and some right here on Earth. Beowulf does all of this. He travels across the sea with his band of warriors to help another king defeat a supernatural monster that has been terrorizing his kingdom. He defeats the monster and the monster's mother in an epic battle, and then goes back home and becomes king himself. In his old age, he has one more monster to face, one more threat that he must keep from his people, a dragon. Now, being an epic hero, of course he wins, but he's also human, and so he also dies. But he leaves behind stories to inspire others, even today. Next, we have our tragic heroes. Tragic heroes are usually leaders or powerful characters, but the tragic hero is also majorly flawed, and that flaw usually leads him down the path to a horrible and tragic death. Take the story of Oedipus the king, for example. One day, a young man travels to a town called Thebes. On the way, he kills a man for not yielding to him on the road, in the first documented case of road rage. He also defeats a magical creature and is rewarded by becoming the king of Thebes and thus marrying their queen. Well, that's not so tragic, right? Wrong. The queen he just married is actually his birth mother. Oedipus was supposed to have been killed as a child by a servant, but instead he was given to another family. Oh, and the man he killed on the road? The previous king of Thebes and his dad. So he killed his father and married his mother. Now that is quite tragic. Not tragic enough for you? Try this one. Romeo Montague is a guy born into a wealthy family and finds the love of his life at a party, Juliet. But Juliet is from a different family that just so happens to hate his family. Instead of being patient and working through the family feud, Romeo decides he must have his love now, and his impatience leads to bloodshed and death, including his own and Juliet's. Moving on to romantic heroes. Now these guys might sound like they might have a better love life and chance at happiness, but that's not always the case. These heroes are emotional and very human, but there is something magical about them. Some have a miraculous birth and then are separated from their family. Others use enchanted swords or get help from magical beings. They can also reject the expectations of society and adhere to their own code of morality. And in the end, the hero triumphs over evil in an idyllic way, but at great personal, emotional sacrifice. King Arthur is a good example of a romantic hero. Sure, he became king and married the love of his life, but he was also killed by his son, who was born out of wedlock, and had his wife cheat on him with his best friend. So although he too, like Beowulf, was a great king, he suffered much more for the greater purpose of society, which makes him more human and relatable to us all. There are different heroes for different situations. Sometimes we need the strong warrior to slay the evils of the world. At other times, we need a common person who becomes great so that they can inspire us all to be better. So do we need heroes? Absolutely. No matter what the time or place, we still need something to believe in. They remind us of the good in each of us and the need for hope and the importance of knowledge.
Commas are tricky things, especially when subordinates and conjunctions are involved. If you can remember a few basic rules, a simple law of physics, and some common scenarios, you will be able to use commas correctly. I like to think of the different parts of our sentence as characters. Let's meet a few of them. The tiny conjunctions, the mighty subordinates, and the clever comma. Conjunctions are small and nimble. They are words that connect clauses, words, and phrases. You can easily remember the conjunctions by remembering the acronym FANBOYS. The conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Because they're so small, more often than not, they require the help of a comma, but not always. Subordinates, on the other hand, are the WWE heavyweight champions of sentences. They are words that connect two unequal things, dependent and independent clauses. Subordinates make it very clear what is being prioritized in a sentence. Commonly used subordinates are although, because, before, however, unless, and even though. Because subordinates are all about power, They can do a lot of heavy lifting by themselves. But, of course, sometimes even the strongest among us need some help from our clever friends. Because our clever Kama is so nice, she often roams her neighborhood looking for some community service to do. Today, as soon as she leaves her house, she sees a subordinate lifting the weight of 2 complete sentences, one on each arm. Bartholomew loves engaging in political debate, even though he usually loses. The Kama asks the subordinate if he needs help. Well, we know that subordinates are the WWE heavyweight champions of sentences. They can easily hold the weight of these 2 complete sentences because they are distributed evenly on both arms. So, when the Kama asks if it can help, the subordinate is appalled at the idea of needing assistance. No thanks. Maybe next time. So the Kama continues on. Soon, she sees a couple of subordinates attempting to lift the weight of sentences directly in front of themselves. Even though Bartholomew loves to sing, he never sings in front of others. The Kama asks the subordinates if they need help. They might not want to admit it, but this time the subordinates do need help. Complete sentences weigh quite a bit. Simple physics tells us that it's easier to balance heavy objects if the weight is evenly distributed. So while the subordinates are quite capable of balancing 2 complete sentences when carrying the weight on both sides, they're having trouble picking just one up. The Kama rushes over to help the struggling subordinates. But how will she help? When subordinates begin sentences, the Kama will place herself directly after the first thought or complete sentence. After helping the subordinates, our Kama heroine continues on and spots a conjunction holding the weight of 2 complete sentences. Bartholomew was accepted into the University of Chicago, and he is on the wait list for Stanford University. The Kama asks the conjunction if he needs help. Of course he does. Hurry! The Kama rushes and places itself before the conjunction. Fanboys aren't as militant as subordinates. For this reason, the Kamas don't have to fall in line behind the fanboys. Fanboys are courteous creatures. They allow the Kama to go ahead of them. Helping others is hard work. On her way home, our Kama sees a conjunction holding up the weight of a complete sentence and a fragment sentence. Bartholomew is going to major in molecular biology, or interpretive dance. The now exhausted Kama asks the conjunction if he needs help lifting the items. This is one of the rare occasions where a conjunction doesn't need the help of a Kama. The conjunction assures the Kama that help isn't needed, which is good for the Kama, because by now all it wants to do is go home and rest up for another day of vigilant sentence constructing.
Ever see a medieval painting of baby Jesus sitting or standing on his mother's lap and wonder why she's so large? Paintings like Cimabue's enthroned Madonna with angels or Duccio's Maesta also appear out of proportion. If Mary were to stand up, it seems, the angels in the picture would be as tall as her shin bone, and her torso would be disproportionately small when compared to her legs. Maybe you thought the artist simply wasn't skilled enough to paint realistically, or lacked the mathematical skill of perspective, but that's not the full story. To understand why, we need to go back to the late 5th century, when the city of Rome was attacked by the Goths. Rome was built in marble and meant to last forever. It represented for many years the pinnacle of human civilization, so its destruction left a huge void. Theologians, who preached about a world beyond the physical, began attracting an audience as Rome crumbled, and Christianity started to fill the void left by the empire. As a replacement for the physical beauty of Rome, Christianity offered a metaphysical beauty of virtue, and an eternal heaven that could not be destroyed as Rome had. After the fall of Rome, early medieval theologians turned away from physical beauty, rejecting it in favor of inner beauty. They maintained that while the physical world was temporary, virtue and religion were permanent. Beautiful objects could lead to a misguided worship of the object rather than a worship of goodness. It is said that the early 6th century preacher Saint Benedict, upon thinking of a beautiful woman, threw himself into a thorn patch, and through his suffering regained his focus on spiritual beauty. He feared his desire for the beautiful woman would distract him from his desire to love God. As European civilization transitioned away from empires and towards religion, monasteries became the gatekeepers of knowledge, which meant that classical books that praised physical pleasures were not copied or protected. Without protection, they became the victims of natural decay, fire, flooding, or pests, and without the help of monks transcribing new copies, these texts and the philosophies they carried disappeared in Western Europe and were replaced by the works of people like Saint Benedict. Which brings us back to these depictions of Jesus and Mary. Because Christianity had so fervently rejected physical beauty, these medieval artists purposefully avoided aesthetically pleasing forms. At first, decorations for churches or palaces were limited to interesting geometric patterns, which could be pleasing without inspiring sinful thoughts of physical pleasure. As the medieval period progressed, depictions of Jesus and Mary were tolerated, but the artist clearly made an effort to veil Mary and give her disproportionately large legs with those enormous shin bones. The fear remained that a beautiful illustration of Mary might inspire the viewer to love the painting or the physical form of Mary, rather than the virtue she's meant to represent. So even though it might be fun to think we can paint more realistically than Cimabue or Duccio, we need to remember that they had different goals when picking up a paintbrush.
Every human being starts out the same way. 2 cells, one from each parent, found each other and became one. And that one cell reproduced itself, dividing and dividing and dividing, until there were 10 trillion of them. Do you realize there's more cells in one person's body than there are stars in the Milky Way? But those 10 trillion cells aren't just sitting there in a big pile. That would make for a pretty boring human being. So what is it that says a nose is a nose and toes is toes? What is it that says this is bone and this is brain and this is heart and this is that little thing in the back of your throat you can never remember the name of? Everything that you are or ever will be made of starts as a tiny book of instructions found in each and every cell. Every time your body wants to make something, it goes back to the instruction book, looks it up, and puts it together. So how does one cell hold all that information? Let's get small. I mean really small, smaller than the tip of a sewing needle. Then we can take a journey inside a single cell to find out what makes up the book of you, your genome. The first thing we see is that the whole genome, all your DNA, is contained inside its own tiny compartment called the nucleus. If we stretched out all the DNA in this one cell into a single thread, it would be over 3 feet long. We have to make it fit in a tiny compartment that's 1,000,000 times smaller. We could just bunch it up like Christmas lights, but that could get messy. We need some organization. First, the long thread of DNA wraps around proteins clustered into little beads called nucleosomes, which end up looking like a long beaded necklace. Then that necklace is wrapped up in its own spiral like an old telephone cord, and those spirals get layered on top of one another until we have a neat little shape that fits inside the nucleus. Voila! 3 feet of DNA squeezed into a tiny compartment. If only we could hire DNA to pack our suitcases. Each tiny mass of DNA is called a chromosome. The book of you would have 46 chapters, 1 for each chromosome. 23 chapters of your book came from your mom, and 23 chapters came from your dad. 2 of those chapters, called X and Y, determine if you're male, XY, or female, XX. Put them together and we get 2 almost identical, but slightly different sets of 23 chapters. The tiny variations are what makes each person different. It's estimated that all the chapters together hold about 20,000 individual instructions called genes. Written out, all those 20,000 instructions are 30 million letters long. If someone were writing 1 letter per second, it would take them almost an entire year to write it once. But it turns out that our genome book is much, much longer than just those 30 million letters. Almost 100 times longer. What are all those extra pages for? Well, each set of instructions has a few pages of nonsense inserted that have to be taken out before we end up with something useful. The parts we throw out we call introns. The instructions we keep we call exons. We can also have hundreds of pages in between each gene. Some of these excess pages were inserted by nasty little infections in our ancestors, but some of them are actually helpful. They protect the ends of each chapter from being damaged, or some help our cells find a particular thing they're looking for, or give the cell a signal to stop making something. All in all, for every page of instructions, there's almost 100 pages of filler. In the end, each of our book's 46 chapters is between 48 and 250 million letters long. That's 3.2 billion letters total. To type all that copy, you'd be at it for over 100 years, and the book would be over 600,000 pages long. Every type of cell carries the same book, but each has a set of bookmarks that tell it exactly which pages it needs to look up. So a bone cell reads only the set of instructions it needs to become bone. Your brain cells? They read the set that tell them how to become brain. If some cells suddenly decide to start reading other instructions, they can actually change from one type to another. So every little cell in your body is holding on to an amazing book full of the instructions for life. Your nose reads nose pages, your toes read toes pages. And that little thing in the back of your throat? It's got its own pages too. They're under uvula.
When we talk, sometimes we say things directly. I'm going to the store. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Other times, though, we talk in a way that conjures up a small scene. It's raining cats and dogs out, we say. Or, I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Metaphors are a way to talk about one thing by describing something else. That may seem roundabout, but it's not. Seeing and hearing and tasting are how we know anything first. The philosopher William James described the world of newborn infants as a buzzing and blooming confusion. Abstract ideas are pale things compared to those first bees and blossoms. Metaphors think with the imagination and the senses. The hot chili peppers in them explode in the mouth and the mind. They're also precise. We don't really stop to think about a raindrop the size of an actual cat or dog, but as soon as I do, I realize that I'm quite certain the dog has to be a small one, a Cocker Spaniel or a Dachshund, and not a Golden Lab or Newfoundland. I think a Beagle might be about right. A metaphor isn't true or untrue in any ordinary sense. Metaphors are art, not science, but they can still feel right or wrong. A metaphor that isn't good leaves you confused. You know what it means to feel like a square wheel, but not what it's like to be tired as a whale. There's a paradox to metaphors. They almost always say things that aren't true. If you say, there's an elephant in the room, there isn't an actual one looking for the peanut dish on the table. Metaphors get under your skin by ghosting right past the logical mind. Plus, we're used to thinking in images. Every night we dream impossible things, and when we wake up, that way of thinking's still in us. We take off our dream shoes and button ourselves into our lives. Some metaphors include the words like or as, sweet as honey, strong as a tree. Those are called similes. A simile is a metaphor that admits it's making a comparison. Similes tend to make you think. Metaphors let you feel things directly. Take Shakespeare's famous metaphor, all the world's a stage. The world is like a stage, just seems thinner and more boring. Metaphors can also live in verbs. Emily Dickinson begins a poem, I saw no way, the heavens were stitched. And we know instantly what it would feel like if the sky were a fabric sewn shut. They can live in adjectives too. Still waters run deep, we say of someone quiet and thoughtful, and the deep matters as much as the stillness and the water do. One of the clearest places to find good metaphors is in poems. Take this haiku by the 18th century Japanese poet Issa. On a branch floating down river, a cricket singing. The first way to meet a metaphor is just to see the world through its eyes. An insect sings from a branch passing by in the middle of the river. Even as you see that, though, some part of you recognizes in the image a small portrait of what it's like to live in this world of change and time. Our human fate is to vanish as surely as that small cricket will, and still we do what it does. We live, we sing. Sometimes a poem takes a metaphor and extends it, building on one idea in many ways. Here's the beginning of Langston Hughes's famous poem, Mother to Son. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor. Langston Hughes is making a metaphor that compares a hard life to a wrecked house you still have to live in. Those splinters and tacks feel real. They hurt your own feet and your own heart. But the mother is describing her life here, not her actual house. And hunger and cold, exhausting work and poverty are what's also inside those splinters. Metaphors aren't always about our human lives and feelings. The Chicago poet Carl Sandburg wrote, "The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches, and then moves on." The comparison here is simple. Fog is being described as a cat. But a good metaphor isn't a puzzle or a way to convey hidden meanings. It's a way to let you feel and know something differently. No one who's heard this poem forgets it. You see fog, and there's a small gray cat nearby. Metaphors give words a way to go beyond their own meaning. They're handles on the door of what we can know and of what we can imagine. Each door leads to some new house and some new world that only that one handle can open. What's amazing is this: by making a handle, you can make a world.
Have you ever noticed that it's harder to start pedaling your bicycle than it is to ride at a constant speed? Or wondered what causes your bicycle to move? Or thought about why it goes forward instead of backwards or sideways? Perhaps not, and you wouldn't be alone. It wasn't until the 17th century that Isaac Newton described the fundamental laws of motion, and we understood the answer to these three questions. What Newton recognized was that things tend to keep on doing what they are already doing. So when your bicycle is stopped, it stays stopped, and when it is going, it stays going. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion, and objects at rest tend to stay at rest. That's Newton's first law. Physicists call it the law of inertia, which is a fancy way of saying that moving objects don't spontaneously speed up, slow down, or change direction. It is this inertia that you must overcome to get your bicycle moving. Now you know that you have to overcome inertia to get your bicycle moving, but what is it that allows you to overcome it? Well, the answer is explained by Newton's second law. In mathematical terms, Newton's second law says that force is the product of mass times acceleration. To cause an object to accelerate or speed up, a force must be applied. The more force you apply, the quicker you accelerate. And the more mass your bicycle has, and the more mass you have too, the more force you have to use to accelerate at the same rate. This is why it would be really difficult to pedal a 10,000-pound bicycle. And it is this force, which is applied by your legs pushing down on the pedals, that allows you to overcome Newton's law of inertia. The harder you push down on the pedals, the bigger the force, and the quicker you accelerate. Now on to the final question. When you do get your bike moving, why does it go forward? According to Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. To understand this, think about what happens when you drop a bouncy ball. As the bouncy ball hits the floor, it causes a downward force on the floor. This is the action. The floor reacts by pushing on the ball with the same force, but in the opposite direction, upward, causing it to bounce back up to you. Together, the floor and the ball form what's called the action-reaction pair. When it comes to your bicycle, it is a little more complicated. As your bicycle wheels spin clockwise, the parts of each tire touching the ground push backwards against the earth. The actions. The ground pushes forward with the same force against each of your tires. The reactions. Since you have two bicycle tires, each one forms an action-reaction pair with the ground. And since the earth is really big compared to your bicycle, it barely moves from the force caused by your bicycle tires pushing backwards. But you are propelled forward.
Blue whales are the largest animals that have ever roamed the planet. They're at least 2 times as big as the biggest dinosaurs.
That's big.
The length of a basketball court and as heavy as 40 African elephants. If that's not enough to make you marvel, here's something that will. They've grown to this enormous size by feeding exclusively on tiny shrimp-like creatures called krill that are no bigger than your little finger. In many ways, the sheer size of krill seems to have driven the evolution of the blue whale. See, krill are so small but are found in dense patches. For increased efficiency, blue whales have evolved to use a feeding strategy called lunge feeding. Basically, the whale accelerates towards a prey patch and opens its mouth wide. To increase the capacity, its mouth expands. The special accordion-like blubber layer that extends from its snout to its belly button enables the whale to engulf large quantities of prey-laden water. With each giant gulp, the whale takes in 125% of its body weight in water and krill. The whale must then expel the water while retaining the yummy krill. To do this, it uses its baleen, the comb-like structure made out of the same stuff our nails and hair are made of, and its tongue. It's pretty crazy that the blue whale's heart is as big as a small car. A child could crawl through its arteries, its tongue weighs as much as an elephant, but its esophagus is so small the whale could choke on a loaf of bread. These whales are really not designed to feed on anything larger than krill. It's estimated that blue whales eat 4 tons of krill per day. Because of their incredible design, each dive provides the blue whale with 90 times as much energy as is used. Every mouthful of krill provides almost 480,000 calories, the same amount you get from eating 1,900 hamburgers. But why are blue whales so big? Blue whales are considerably larger than the largest living land animal, the elephant. The heavier an animal is, the greater its relative surface area. As weight increases, there's a point at which the legs of that animal would simply collapse. That explains why elephants don't stand on the delicate legs of a horse. They need legs shaped like stout pedestals to hold their bodies up against gravity. In water, the situation is quite different. Buoyancy counteracts the gravitational pull on the body, and their great bulk is therefore partially supported by the water. So the ocean is a great place for species that want to grow bigger. The other secret to their size is their diet. By evolving such a huge mouth, the whales have specialized to catch enormous quantities of highly abundant and nutritious prey, which provides the energy needed to grow so big. But now, maybe you're wondering why blue whales aren't any bigger. After all, the ocean sounds like nirvana for any growing beast. Well, while lunge feeding may have allowed blue whales to become the biggest animal to have ever roamed the planet, by enabling them to feed efficiently in dense prey patches, it isn't cost-free. Scientists compared all the costs involved with lunge feeding to the energy gained from the krill they eat. What they found was that when the whale's body increases in size, the energy their body demands rises faster than the extra energy they get from their food. Feeding whales need 15 times the energy required to remain still and 5 times more energy than used when swimming. Calculations show that the largest a lunge feeder can grow is 33 meters, pretty much blue whale size. Turns out blue whales have a lot to thank krill for. Neat evolutionary adaptations that would not have been possible if krill were not so small. It's incredible that these tiny creatures have allowed the blue whales to really push the limits of size on our planet. Makes you wonder if that old adage, "you are what you eat," really does apply in blue whale world.